The morning it happened did not feel dramatic at first. It felt quiet in a way that pressed against my ribs. I woke before the alarm, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above me. The house made its usual sounds, but they felt sharper somehow. The refrigerator hummed like it was holding its breath. The floorboards creaked in short, careful complaints beneath distant footsteps. My mother was already awake, which was unusual for her. She liked to sleep late and let the house wait. But that morning I heard cabinet doors closing with deliberate precision. Not slamming, not gentle, just controlled. Controlled was her favorite mood. I lay there for a moment, listening to the rhythm downstairs. Coffee pouring into her ceramic mug. The spoon tapping twice against the rim. The chair legs scraping slightly against the kitchen tile. Nothing was loud, but nothing was soft either. When I walked into the kitchen, she did not look up immediately. She stirred her coffee as if she were finishing a thought. The sunlight coming through the window landed across the table between us. It felt like a line drawn carefully down the center. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice steady and polite. She nodded without smiling.
"Morning."
The word felt smaller than usual. I poured myself coffee and stood at the counter. I could feel her watching me, even without meeting her eyes. There is a way a person can look at you that makes you aware of your own breathing. That morning, I was suddenly aware of everything. I asked about her doctor's appointment later that week. I asked if she needed anything from the store. I asked small questions that usually softened her mood. She answered, but each response carried an edge. Short sentences. No extra warmth. No familiar complaints about the weather or neighbors. Just answers. I sat across from her, and the silence expanded. It wasn't new, but it felt heavier. Like something had already been decided without me. For years, I had learned to read her quiet. There was tired quiet. There was disappointed quiet. There was irritated quiet. This was different. This felt like conclusion quiet. She finally looked at me directly. Her expression was calm, almost thoughtful. But her eyes had that distant look she used before making announcements. "You've been here a long time," she said carefully. The sentence did not sound cruel. It sounded factual. But it landed in my chest like a stone. "I know," I replied softly. "I've tried to make things easier." She took another sip of coffee before responding. "I didn't say you didn't." There it was again. Measured.
Precise.
I looked around the kitchen slowly. The cabinets I had repainted 3 summers ago. The faucet I replaced after it started leaking at midnight. The small herb planter by the window that I kept alive through winter. I had not just lived here. I had maintained it, protected it, held it together in quiet ways that rarely got mentioned. Still, the air felt like it no longer recognized me. She set her mug down gently. "I think it might be time for you to think about what's next." The words were delivered almost kindly. But kindness can carry dismissal when it wants to. "What do you mean?" I asked. She folded her hands together on the table. "You're not a child anymore. You need your own place." I swallowed slowly. "I contribute here," I said carefully. "I pay bills. I handle repairs." She nodded, but her nod did not agree with me. "It's still my house." The sentence lingered between us. Not shouted. Not emphasized. Just placed there deliberately. My house. I had heard those words before, of course. But this time they felt like a boundary line being redrawn. I wanted to argue. I wanted to remind her of the nights I stayed up with her when she could not sleep. The paperwork I handled when her hands shook too much to sign. The appointments I rearranged so she would not feel overwhelmed. Instead, I kept my voice even. I thought we were helping each other. She looked down at the table. "We were," she said quietly. "But things change." The way she said it told me something had already shifted. Not that morning. Not suddenly. Gradually, without my permission. I felt like I was standing on the same floor, but the foundation had moved. She stood from the table and rinsed her mug. I just think you should start planning. Planning. The word sounded reasonable on the surface. Responsible, even. But it carried urgency underneath. How much time are you thinking? I asked. She dried her hands with a dish towel. I don't know, she replied. Soon. Soon is a word that offers no safety. She walked toward the hallway, without another glance at me. The conversation was over for her. For me, it had just begun. I remained at the table long after she left the room. The sunlight had shifted slightly, brightening the surface between us. The house felt larger somehow. Or maybe I felt smaller inside it. I realized then that something fundamental had changed. Not the walls, not the furniture, but my position within it. I was no longer family sharing space. I was someone being measured against a deadline. The house had always felt like history. Photographs on the staircase. Holiday dinners in the dining room. Arguments and apologies layered into the drywall. Now it felt like property. And property can be reassigned. I stood slowly and rinsed my own mug. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not. Every corner of the kitchen suddenly felt temporary. I walked into the living room and paused near the bookshelf. I ran my fingers across the spines of old albums. The air was still quiet, but it no longer felt neutral. It felt like a countdown had begun. That was the morning I understood something important. You can live somewhere for years and still not belong. You can invest time, money, and loyalty into walls that never truly recognize you. The air had changed before any official words were spoken. Before ultimatums. Before raised voices. It changed in tone, in posture, in ownership language spoken casually over coffee. And as I stood there listening to the house breathe around me, I realized that whatever happened next would not be accidental. It would be deliberate. Just like her stirring the coffee. Just like the way she said, "It's still my house." I did not argue that morning. I did not defend myself beyond a few careful sentences. But I felt something shift inside me as well. Not anger.
Not yet. Clarity.
The day the air changed was not loud. It was precise. And I knew even then, that precision meant something had already been set in motion. I just did not know how far she was prepared to take it. When I first moved back into my mother's house, it was never meant to be permanent. At least, that's what we both said out loud. I had just finalized my divorce, and everything felt unstable. My savings were thinner than I admitted to anyone. The apartment I rented afterward never felt settled or safe. She was the one who suggested I come home. Just until you get back on your feet, she had said gently. Her voice carried concern back then, not calculation. I remember standing in the driveway with my packed car. The house looked exactly the same as when I left years earlier. Same white siding, same rose bushes near the porch. It felt less like moving in and more like rewinding time. The first few months were almost peaceful. We shared dinners and watched television together most evenings. She told neighbors proudly that her daughter was home again. There was no tension in the word home then. I made it clear from the beginning that I would contribute. I transferred money into her account every month without fail. I covered groceries, utility bills, and small maintenance costs. It felt important to me not to be seen as dependent. She accepted the money without resistance at first. But she never referred to it as shared responsibility. It was always framed as helping out. That subtle phrasing mattered more than I realized. When the faucet in the kitchen started leaking, I fixed it. When the washing machine broke, I researched replacements and paid the deposit. When the roof shingles lifted after a storm, I scheduled repairs. Each time, she would thank me briefly. Then she would add, almost casually, "It's good you're learning these things." Learning. As if I were a teenager gaining experience. Not a grown woman managing real expenses. The longer I stayed, the more invisible my contributions became. The bills I paid blended into the background. The repairs felt expected rather than appreciated. I began to notice small shifts in language. This is my living room. My kitchen rules. My house needs quiet after 10. It was never shouted, never aggressive, just repeated gently until it formed a pattern. I tried to ignore it at first. I told myself she was from a different generation. Ownership meant security to her. Language was habit, not intention. But intention reveals itself over time. When relatives visited, she would introduce me differently. She's staying with me for a while. She's figuring things out. It didn't matter that I had steady work. It didn't matter that I covered nearly half the monthly expenses. The narrative remained unchanged. I became someone temporarily occupying space. There were evenings when I felt like a boarder instead of a daughter. If I rearranged a shelf slightly, she would move it back quietly. If I cooked something new, she would comment on how it wasn't traditional. Small corrections. Small reminders. The house began to feel less shared and more supervised. I adjusted my routines slowly. I lowered the volume on the television even when she was asleep. I avoided inviting friends over to prevent uncomfortable questions. I asked permission before making simple changes. Asking permission became habit. One afternoon, I overheard her speaking on the phone. Her voice carried down the hallway toward my room.
She's still here, she said softly.
I'm not sure how long this will last. The word stopped me mid-step. Still here. As if I were weather that hadn't cleared. I stood in my doorway for a long time after that. Not angry, just aware. Aware that my presence had shifted from welcome to tolerated. The tension wasn't dramatic. It was layered and quiet. It lived in pauses between sentences. I began working longer hours when possible. Not because I needed the money urgently, but because being home felt heavier than before. The house had rules I had not agreed to. Invisible expectations shaped my movements. I measured my own footsteps down the hallway. At dinner one night, she mentioned property taxes casually. They keep going up every year, she said with a sigh. It's hard managing a house alone. I reminded her that I contributed monthly. She nodded, but the nod dismissed the point. It's still my responsibility in the end, she replied. My responsibility. The phrase returned like a refrain. That was the moment I first felt like a guest. Not because she asked me to leave, but because she separated ownership from partnership. I had assumed we were building something stable together. She saw it as temporary assistance. The longer that misunderstanding remained unspoken, the wider the emotional gap grew between us. I started keeping records quietly. Receipts for repairs. Transfers for bills. Emails from contractors confirming payments. I told myself it was practical organization. But deep down, I think I needed proof. Proof that I had not imagined my contribution. The house did not feel hostile. It felt conditional. As long as I stayed within invisible lines, things remained peaceful. But peace built on imbalance is fragile. Sometimes I would stand in the kitchen at night alone. The refrigerator humming softly behind me. The overhead light casting pale shadows across the counter. I would look around and ask myself a simple question. Was I rebuilding my life here, or postponing it? The answer changed depending on the day. There were moments of warmth still. Shared laughter over old memories. Quiet mornings with coffee before tension surfaced. But underneath those moments, I sensed a timeline I was not controlling. The house remained familiar. The photographs remained on the walls. But my place inside the story felt uncertain. I did not realize then how quickly uncertainty can turn into displacement. I only knew that somewhere along the way, I had stopped feeling like a daughter returning home, and started feeling like someone whose welcome had an expiration date attached. I just didn't know when it would be spoken out loud. There is a kind of work that leaves no visible record. It does not come with a paycheck or applause. It settles quietly into the corners of a house. That was the work I began doing without thinking. My mother's knees had started bothering her more frequently. She never admitted pain directly, but I noticed the hesitation. The slight pause before climbing the stairs. The careful grip on the kitchen counter after standing too long. So, I adjusted my routines without announcing them. I carried laundry baskets before she could reach for them. I mowed the lawn on weekends without waiting to be asked. I sorted through mail and handled insurance calls patiently. None of it felt heroic. It felt natural, like something a daughter would simply do. At first, she thanked me more often. Her voice would soften slightly in those moments. "I don't know what I'd do without you," she once said. That sentence stayed with me longer than it should have, because over time, it disappeared. Gratitude slowly shifted into expectation. If I came home late from work, she would glance at the sink. If the trash wasn't taken out immediately, she would sigh. If I forgot to refill her prescriptions, she would grow unusually quiet. Not angry, just disappointed in a way that felt instructional. I began organizing her medical paperwork in labeled folders. I kept track of appointment dates in a shared calendar. I filled out forms she no longer had patience for. The house ran smoothly because I made it run smoothly. But smooth systems are invisible when they function well. One evening, I overheard her speaking to a neighbor near the fence. "She helps around here," she said casually. "It's the least she can do while she's staying." The least she can do. The words landed harder than I expected. I stood in the hallway that evening longer than necessary, trying to decide if I had misheard the tone. Trying to convince myself she meant nothing by it. But intention reveals itself through repetition. There were other small moments that followed. Comments disguised as advice. Observations wrapped inside politeness. "You know, independence is important at your age. You don't want to rely on anyone forever. People talk, you know." She never accused me directly of dependency, but the suggestion hovered constantly between us. The strange part was that I was not relying on her financially. In many ways, she depended on me more than she admitted. Yet the narrative outside the house remained unchanged. She still described me as getting back on my feet, as if I had never regained balance. I started noticing how she introduced ownership in conversation. When contractors came, she spoke as sole decision-maker. When relatives visited, she described the house's history in possessive terms. When bills arrived, she emphasized long years of responsibility. I existed in those conversations only as support staff. The more invisible my work became, the more visible her control seemed to grow. There were evenings when she would stand in the doorway of my room, not entering, just observing quietly. Her expression unreadable but assessing. "You've been here longer than expected," she said once. Her voice wasn't sharp. It was almost reflective. "I know," I answered, keeping my tone calm. She nodded slowly, as if confirming a private calculation. The air in those moments felt thinner. I began to sense that my contributions were not building security. They were building leverage. Leverage for her to say, I should be grateful. Leverage for her to remind me whose roof covered us both. Sometimes she would bring up stories from years ago. How she managed everything alone after my father passed. How she carried burdens without complaint. I respected those memories deeply. But they were often told during moments when I expressed fatigue, as if resilience belonged only to her generation. One night, after paying the electric bill online, I mentioned casually that rates had increased again. She looked up from her knitting slowly. "That's why owning a home is serious," she replied. "It's not something everyone can handle." The implication sat between us, unspoken but clear. I did not argue. Arguing would have turned the moment sharp. Instead, I nodded and returned to my laptop screen. But inside, something shifted. I started keeping more detailed records than before. Copies of bank transfers saved in organized folders. Receipts scanned and uploaded to cloud storage. Dates noted beside each expense I covered. It wasn't about proving a point yet. It was about protecting my sense of reality. When someone slowly reframes your presence as temporary, you begin to question your own memory. Was I overestimating my contribution? Was I misunderstanding her tone? The house itself felt unchanged physically, but emotionally, it had become layered with quiet tension. I began sleeping lighter at night. Small sounds in the hallway would wake me quickly, not out of fear, but out of alertness. Alertness that something was building. The unspoken threats were never direct. She never said, "You need to leave immediately." She never demanded rent increases or ultimatums outright. Instead, she planted suggestions gently. "You should start thinking about your next move. It's good not to get too comfortable. You never know how long arrangements last." Arrangements. That word felt transactional, as if the years of shared meals and memories had been converted into a short-term lease. I began noticing how she checked the mailbox herself more often, how she paused slightly when looking at documents on the dining table, how she asked subtle questions about my savings. Not curious questions, strategic ones. The realization came slowly, like dusk settling. The work I did kept the house stable, but stability did not equal security for me. In her mind, I was helpful, but I was also replaceable. And once that understanding settled into my chest, I knew something important. When the time came, she would not hesitate. Not because she hated me, but because control mattered more to her than partnership. And control requires a single owner. The unseen work I had done for years had never truly changed my status in her eyes. I was contributing. I was maintaining. I was supporting. But I was not, in her narrative, entitled to belong. That knowledge did not make me angry. Not yet. It made me careful. Because when someone begins planting quiet reminders that you are temporary, you start preparing for the day they decide to say it clearly. And I could feel, even then, that clarity was coming. The afternoon it finally happened, the house felt unusually still. Not peaceful, just suspended. I had come home earlier than usual from work. A meeting had been canceled, leaving me with unexpected quiet hours. I remember feeling almost grateful for the break. The sun was low, but still bright, through the living room windows. Dust moved slowly in the light like it had nowhere urgent to be. My mother was sitting upright on the couch, hands folded tightly together. She did not turn on the television that day. That should have been my first warning. I set my keys down gently on the entry table. She looked at them instead of at me. Her eyes followed the sound, then lifted slowly to my face. "We need to talk," she said evenly. There was no anger in her voice. That almost made it worse. I sat in the armchair across from her. The distance between us felt deliberate and measured. "About what?" I asked quietly. She inhaled slowly, as if rehearsed. "I think it's time you move out." The words did not echo. They did not explode. They landed softly, like something long decided. I blinked once, unsure I had heard correctly. "Move out," I repeated carefully. "Yes," she said, still calm. "You've stayed long enough." Long enough. The phrase carried no appreciation, only expiration. "I thought we were still figuring things out," I replied. "I contribute here. I handle most of the upkeep." She nodded once, dismissively. "That doesn't change the fact that this is my house." There it was again. Clearer now. My house. The sunlight shifted across the carpet as she spoke. Everything felt strangely normal around us. The clock ticked steadily on the wall. But inside my chest, something tightened. "How much time are you giving me?" I asked slowly. She folded her hands tighter in her lap. "A few weeks should be enough." "A few weeks." I stared at her face, searching for hesitation. There was none. "What happened?" I asked softly. "Did I do something?" She exhaled through her nose, controlled and steady. "No. I just think it's better this way." Better for who, I wanted to ask. But I already knew the answer. "I've been paying half the utilities," I reminded her. "I repaired the roof. I replaced the water heater." She shifted slightly on the couch. "That was helpful," she admitted. But help doesn't mean ownership. Ownership. The word felt sharp now, no longer subtle. I felt heat rise slowly in my face, but I kept my voice level. I never claimed ownership, I said carefully. I just thought this was still home. She looked at me then with something almost like pity. You're too comfortable here, she replied. That's not healthy for you. The decision had already been justified in her mind. Comfort had become a flaw. I stood slowly from the chair, needing distance. The room felt smaller than before. The walls seemed closer, though nothing had moved. So this is final? I asked quietly. She hesitated for a fraction of a second. Yes. There was no anger, no shouting, just finality. I'll need time to find somewhere stable, I said. You've had time, she replied calmly. You just haven't used it. The accusation landed heavier than the deadline. For a moment, I considered arguing, listing every bill I paid, every appointment I managed, every repair I handled without complaint. But something inside me shifted instead. Not rage, not pleading, clarity. She had already rewritten the narrative. In her version, I was lingering. In her version, I was dependent. Nothing I said in that moment would change her storyline. She stood up slowly, smoothing invisible wrinkles from her blouse. I'll expect you to start packing soon, she added quietly. The casual tone made it feel administrative, as if I were a tenant whose lease had expired. I walked toward the hallway without another word. My steps felt heavy, but controlled. I did not want to give her the satisfaction of visible panic. Inside my bedroom, I closed the door softly behind me. The space suddenly looked temporary. The bed, the dresser, the small framed photo on the nightstand. Everything felt borrowed. I sat down on the edge of the mattress and exhaled slowly. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were racing. A few weeks. She had reduced years of shared living into a deadline. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen again, cabinet doors opening and closing with deliberate calm, the normal rhythm of the house resuming, as if nothing significant had just happened. I realized then that she did not expect resistance. She expected compliance. That hurt more than the request itself. She believed I would pack quietly, find somewhere smaller, disappear from the center of the house without disruption. The thought of leaving filled me with a strange mix of grief and disbelief. Not because I couldn't survive elsewhere, but because of how easily I had been repositioned. I stood up slowly and walked to the window. The yard looked the same as it always had. The old oak tree casting long evening shadows. Nothing outside reflected the shift that had just occurred inside. But everything felt different now. The conversation had been calm, measured, almost polite, and yet it carried the weight of eviction. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, I began thinking carefully. About timing, about records, about what had been said, and what had not. Because beneath the quiet of her voice, beneath the steady ticking clock, I felt something deeper. This was not just about space. It was about control. And for the first time, I began to consider whether she truly understood everything about this house, or whether she had forgotten something important. I did not pack that night. That was the first quiet decision I made for myself. Instead of folding clothes into boxes, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The room felt smaller than it ever had before. Not because the walls had moved, but because the ground beneath them had shifted. She expected panic. She expected tears, maybe bargaining. What she did not expect was silence. I pulled open the bottom drawer of my desk slowly. Inside was a thin blue folder I had not touched in months. It looked ordinary, almost forgettable. I rested my hand on it for a moment before lifting it out. Some documents carry more than ink. They carry history. Years ago, after my father passed, everything changed quickly. My mother had been overwhelmed with paperwork and legal meetings. Insurance claims, property assessments, endless signatures. I handled most of it because she could not. At the time, she trusted me completely. She would push papers toward me across the dining table. "Just tell me where to sign," she would say. We met with an attorney to review the estate. The house had originally been in both their names. After his death, there were decisions to make about transfer and protection. I remember that meeting clearly. The office smelled faintly of old carpet and polished wood. The attorney spoke slowly, explaining long-term security options. He suggested adding my name to the deed. Not for control, but for protection. "If something happens suddenly," he had said, "this ensures stability and avoids complications." My mother had agreed, without hesitation back then. She trusted me. We signed the documents together. There was no drama in that moment. No suspicion. Just paperwork meant to protect the family. Over time, that memory faded for her. Or perhaps she chose to forget it. But I never did. I kept copies of everything. Not because I anticipated conflict, but because organization was how I managed anxiety. The blue folder in my hands held certified copies of the updated deed. My name printed clearly beneath hers. Joint ownership with rights of survivorship. Legal language, calm and precise. I opened the folder carefully and reread the document. The date at the top felt distant now. A different version of us had signed that page. Back then, we were aligned. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. The house around me suddenly felt different. Not borrowed. Not conditional.
Shared.
The words settled quietly inside me. Shared ownership changes the meaning of eviction. I did not feel triumphant reading those papers. I felt steady. There is a difference. Triumph is loud. Steadiness is quiet and grounded. She believed she held complete authority. She believed she could set deadlines unilaterally. But authority divided is not absolute. I closed the folder and set it on the desk gently. My heartbeat had slowed. The tightness in my chest had softened. This was not about revenge. It was about truth. I thought back to the conversation earlier that afternoon. "It's my house," she had said calmly. Not entirely, I thought now. Not entirely. I stood up and walked slowly around the room. The dresser I assembled myself last year. The window I resealed before winter storms. The light fixture I replaced when it flickered constantly. I had not been building temporary comfort. I had been maintaining shared property. The difference mattered. Still, I knew revealing this truth would not be simple. Legal documents do not erase emotional tension. They clarify power, but they do not soften pride. My mother valued control deeply. Ownership represented independence for her generation. If she had forgotten the deed details, reminding her would feel like a challenge. But silence would mean surrendering my reality. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop again. I searched the county property records online. The public database confirmed what I already knew. Both our names appeared clearly. Seeing it on the official website added another layer of certainty. This was not a misunderstanding. It was fact. I closed the browser and folded my hands together. The house felt quieter now. Not tense. Just waiting. Down the hallway, I could hear her moving around in the kitchen. The soft rhythm of dishes being stacked. The hum of the dishwasher starting. She sounded relaxed.
Certain.
That certainty would shift soon. But I did not want confrontation fueled by anger. I wanted clarity delivered calmly. There is power in calm revelation. I slid the blue folder back into the drawer. Not hiding it, but preparing it. Timing would matter. If I reacted immediately, it would look defensive. If I waited too long, it would look strategic. I needed the right moment. I sat back on the bed and exhaled slowly. The fear I felt earlier had been replaced with something steadier. Security. Not emotional security, not yet. But structural security. She could ask me to leave. She could suggest independence. She could frame the situation as temporary. But she could not legally remove me. The realization did not make me smile. It made me thoughtful. Because once truth is revealed, relationships change permanently. I knew that showing her the deed would not fix our tension. It would expose it. And exposure carries consequences. Still, I refused to be erased quietly. I lay back against the pillows and stared at the ceiling. The fan turned slowly above me, steady and predictable. Earlier that day, the house had felt unstable beneath my feet. Now it felt anchored again, not because she had softened, but because I remembered something she had forgotten. We signed those papers together. Protection was never meant to become confrontation. But protection remains valid, even when trust shifts. I closed my eyes and let the silence settle.
Tomorrow would not be dramatic.
It would be deliberate. And when the time came, I would not shout. I would simply open the envelope. I did not bring up the deed the next morning. That restraint mattered more than I expected. Revealing truth in the wrong tone can turn facts into weapons. I did not want a weapon. I wanted clarity. The house moved through its usual routine the following day. Coffee brewed. The morning news murmured softly in the background. My mother avoided eye contact, but not obviously. She behaved as if the deadline had already been accepted. That assumption gave her comfort. I went to work and completed my day as scheduled. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I spoke in steady, professional sentences. But beneath the routine, I was thinking carefully. During my lunch break, I stepped outside the office building. The winter air was sharp against my face. I dialed the attorney's number from memory. He answered on the third ring. His voice was older now, slightly slower than before. I introduced myself and explained why I was calling. There was a pause while he searched records. Paper shuffled faintly on his end of the line. Yes, he said finally. I see the deed modification here. His tone remained neutral and procedural. That property is jointly held, exactly as you described. I exhaled slowly, though I already knew the answer. There's no condition attached? I asked carefully. No clause that changes ownership? No, he replied evenly. Joint ownership with survivorship rights. Both parties have equal standing. Equal standing. Hearing it spoken aloud changed something inside me. I thanked him and ended the call. The sky above the parking lot looked pale and distant. For months, I had felt like a temporary figure in my own life. Now the ground felt solid beneath my shoes. I returned to my desk and finished the day quietly. There was no rush in my movements. No outward sign of internal shift. That was intentional. Truth does not need theatrics. When I drove home that evening, I noticed the house differently. The porch light glowed faintly in the dusk. The oak tree cast long shadows across the lawn. It no longer looked like a place I was being removed from. It looked like shared property awaiting a conversation. Inside, she was preparing dinner. The scent of garlic and onions filled the kitchen. Ordinary sounds continued as though nothing had changed. Long day? She asked casually. Yes, I replied. Productive. The word held more meaning for me than she realized. We ate in near silence. The conversation stayed superficial. Weather, groceries, a neighbor's dog barking at night. Beneath it all, tension lingered like static. After dinner, she stood and began clearing plates. I hope you've started thinking about apartments, she said lightly. The sentence floated between us. I wiped my hands carefully with a napkin. I've been thinking, I replied evenly. She paused for half a second. Good, she said. I rose from the table slowly and walked to my bedroom. My steps were measured, not hurried. Inside the room, I opened the desk drawer and removed the blue folder. The paper edges felt cool and firm in my hands. I stood there for a moment, grounding myself. This was not a fight. It was a correction. I returned to the kitchen where she stood by the sink. The water ran steadily over stacked dishes. Mom, I said calmly. She turned slightly, towel in her hands. Yes, I think there's something important we need to review. Her expression tightened almost imperceptibly. What now? I placed the folder gently on the counter between us. Not slammed. Not dramatic. Just present. She looked at it without touching it. What is that? She asked. Copies of the deed. I answered evenly. Her hands stilled against the dish towel. I called the attorney today. I continued calmly. Just to confirm everything. She stared at the folder for several seconds. Then she reached forward and opened it slowly. Her eyes scanned the first page. Then the second. The room felt incredibly quiet. Even the dishwasher seemed to hum more softly. That was years ago, she said finally. Yes, I replied. When Dad passed. She kept reading, her brow tightening. I remember signing paperwork, she said carefully. But I didn't think. You agreed to joint ownership. I finished gently. For protection. The word protection hung in the air. She closed the folder slowly. Her shoulders straightened slightly. You're using that against me, she said quietly. No, I answered. I'm reminding you of what we decided together. There was no anger in my voice. Only steadiness. You said this was your house. I continued. It's ours. The statement was factual, not emotional. She looked at me, as if seeing a different version of me. Not defensive. Not pleading.
Certain.
This changes things, she said slowly. Yes, I replied. It does. She stepped back slightly from the counter. The authority in her posture had shifted. Not gone, but balanced. You should have mentioned this earlier, she said. You never asked, I answered quietly. Silence settled between us again. But it felt different now. Earlier, silence felt like dismissal. Now it felt like recalculation. She looked down at the folder once more. I didn't think it mattered, she said softly. It matters, I replied. Because ownership is not only about property. It is about voice. For years, I had contributed quietly. For years, I accepted subtle repositioning. But proof changes posture. And I stood there calmly, not as someone being evicted, but as someone with equal standing. No raised voices followed. No dramatic accusations. Just the slow realization that the narrative she had relied on was incomplete, and for the first time in months, the house felt balanced beneath my feet. The night after I showed her the deed, neither of us slept well. I could hear her pacing softly down the hallway past midnight. The floorboards carried each step like a question being repeated. She stopped once outside my door, then continued walking. In the morning, the air felt different again. Not tense in the same way as before. Not dismissive either. It felt unsettled. I walked into the kitchen and found her already seated at the table. The blue folder lay in front of her, closed neatly. Her coffee sat untouched beside it. She looked up when I entered. Her expression was not angry. It was measured. We need to clarify something, she said calmly. I poured myself coffee before responding. I agree. She tapped the folder lightly with her fingertips. You never paid the mortgage, she said evenly. There hasn't been a mortgage in years, I replied quietly. Dad paid it off before he passed. She inhaled slowly through her nose. That house was ours long before you were involved. Yes, I answered. And you chose to add me legally after he died. The word chose seemed to irritate her. I didn't understand all the implications, she said carefully. The attorney spoke quickly. He explained joint ownership clearly, I replied. We both signed after reviewing it. She leaned back slightly in her chair. You think this means you can control things now? The accusation was subtle, but present. No, I said evenly. I think it means we have to make decisions together. She stared at me for a long moment. Her eyes searched my face for something defensive, but I kept my posture steady. For years, she had spoken from a position of authority. Now she was speaking from uncertainty. That doesn't change the fact that you were planning to leave, she said. I was planning to consider your request, I replied carefully. But legally, I cannot be removed. The sentence felt strange to say out loud. Firm, but not aggressive. Her jaw tightened slightly. You blindsided me, she said. No, I answered softly. We both signed those papers. Silence stretched across the table. The clock ticked in the background, patient and indifferent. I was trying to push you toward independence, she said finally. You've been too comfortable. I let the words settle before responding. I've been contributing financially and physically for years, I said calmly. That isn't comfort. That's responsibility. She looked away toward the window. The oak tree outside swayed lightly in the wind. You've changed, she murmured. Maybe I had. Not into someone louder. Not into someone cruel. But into someone who would not shrink automatically. I don't want control, I continued gently. I want fairness. The word fairness lingered. She folded her hands together tightly. So, what are you saying? She asked. I'm saying we can't pretend I'm temporary anymore, I replied. If decisions are being made about this house, I'm involved.
Her shoulders stiffened at that.
You're threatening me in my own home, she said quietly. No, I corrected gently. I'm standing in our home. The difference mattered deeply. For a moment, I thought she might raise her voice. Instead, she stood slowly from the table. This is not how I imagine things, she said. It's not how I imagined them either, I answered. She walked toward the living room without another word. I remained seated, letting the stillness settle around me. The confrontation had not been explosive, but it had shifted the foundation of our relationship. She could no longer rely on assumptions. She could no longer present me as temporary without challenge. Later that afternoon, my sister called unexpectedly. I heard things got tense, she said cautiously. I knew immediately who had informed her. She tried to make me leave, I said evenly. I showed her the deed. There was a pause on the other end. You actually used that? My sister asked. I didn't use it, I replied. I acknowledged it. My sister exhaled quietly. Mom's upset. I'm aware, I said softly. When I ended the call, I understood something important. The shift was no longer private. It was expanding outward. By evening, my mother's posture had changed again. Not confrontational, but guarded. She avoided unnecessary conversation. She closed doors gently but firmly. The house no longer felt like a stage for quiet control. It felt like neutral territory. And neutrality unsettles people who are used to dominance. That night, as I stood in the kitchen washing dishes, she entered slowly and stood beside me. I don't want this to become ugly, she said quietly. Neither do I replied. Then maybe we should rethink everything, she continued. I'm open to discussion, I answered. But not erasure. She looked at me differently then. Not as a child. Not as a dependent. But as an equal participant in something she once controlled alone. Reality had arrived. Not loudly. Not violently. But firmly. The deed had done more than protect my housing. It had forced a recalibration of power. And in that recalibration, we were both learning what shared truly meant. By the weekend, it was no longer just between us. I knew that would happen. My mother had never processed conflict privately for long. Silence, for her, was only temporary strategy. Saturday afternoon, my sister arrived without warning. Her car pulled into the driveway with familiar impatience. The tires crunched against gravel like an announcement. I was in the living room when she walked in. She didn't hug me. She didn't smile. She went straight to the kitchen where Mom was waiting. The house felt like it was holding its breath again. I stayed seated at first, listening to low voices rising and falling. Not shouting,
but charged.
After a few minutes, my sister called out, "We need to talk. All of us." The phrase felt rehearsed. I joined them at the kitchen table. The same table where years ago we signed estate documents calmly. Now it felt like a courtroom. My sister folded her arms across her chest. You didn't have to blindside her like that, she said directly. I didn't blindside anyone, I replied evenly. I reminded her of something we both signed. Mom sat quietly, letting my sister take the lead. It was a familiar pattern. She says you're trying to take over, my sister continued. I looked at my mother carefully. Her gaze remained fixed on the table. I never said that, Mom murmured softly. But she hadn't corrected the narrative either. I'm not taking over, I said calmly. I'm refusing to disappear. My sister exhaled sharply. You could have just moved out peacefully. Peacefully. The word felt strangely misplaced. She asked me to leave a property I legally co-own, I replied. That isn't peaceful. That's dismissal. My sister's jaw tightened. You've been living here for years, she said. Maybe it's time. I've also been paying for years, I answered. Bills, repairs, maintenance. Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat. That was your choice, she said quietly. Yes, I agreed. Because I thought we were building stability together. Silence settled again, heavier this time. The front door opened suddenly. My brother stepped inside, holding his phone in his hand. I just came to make sure this doesn't get out of control, he said. Out of control. As if truth itself was instability. Within minutes, the kitchen felt crowded. Not physically overwhelming, but emotionally layered. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a version. My sister insisted I was being strategic. My brother suggested I should compromise. Mom remained quiet, absorbing sympathy without rejecting it. For years, I had been the reasonable one, the calm one, the one who avoided confrontation. Now, simply stating facts felt like aggression to them. You knew she'd forget about that deed, my sister said suddenly. I looked at her carefully. She didn't forget, I replied. She chose not to think about it. My brother shook his head. This is tearing the family apart, he said. No, I corrected softly. Control was already doing that. The word control made the room tense visibly. Mom finally looked up at me directly. You're making me look foolish, she said quietly. I never intended that, I answered. But pretending I have no standing makes me invisible. My sister stood abruptly from her chair. You could just sell your share and walk away, she said. The suggestion stunned me more than the confrontation. Sell my share. Reduce years of memory and contribution into a transaction. That isn't what I want, I said calmly. I want fairness and mutual decisions. My brother ran a hand across his face. This was simpler before, he muttered.
Of course it was.
Before, I absorbed imbalance quietly. Before, Mom's authority went unquestioned. Now the structure had shifted. And shifting structures reveal fault lines. A neighbor's dog barked outside faintly. The sound felt distant and irrelevant. Inside, roles were being reassigned. My sister softened her tone slightly. Mom feels betrayed, she said. I looked at my mother carefully. Betrayed by what? I asked gently. By a document she signed willingly? Mom's voice trembled slightly when she answered. I thought you'd never use it. Use it? As if acknowledging legality was a weapon. I'm not using it against you, I said quietly. I'm using it to protect myself. The difference seemed difficult for them to accept. For the first time, I noticed something in my siblings' expressions. Not just frustration.
Fear.
Fear that the balance of influence had changed. Fear that Mom no longer stood alone at the top. They were used to her authority being absolute. They were used to me being cooperative. Now neither assumption held. My brother leaned forward slightly. So what happens now? He asked. I answered carefully. Now we acknowledge reality, I said. And we decide things together. The room quieted again. Mom looked smaller somehow. Not physically, but emotionally recalibrated. The mask of sole ownership had slipped. Not ripped away. Just lowered enough to expose uncertainty. I don't want to fight my children, she said softly. Neither do I replied. But the fight had never been about shouting. It had been about narrative. And the narrative was no longer one-sided. When my siblings finally left that evening, the house felt unusually silent. Mom remained seated at the table long after they drove away. I stood near the window, watching headlights disappear down the street. The confrontation had not exploded. It had unfolded slowly, revealing layers. Masks of authority, masks of compliance, and underneath them, a truth none of us could ignore anymore. This house was no longer ruled by assumption.
It was governed by fact.
And facts, once spoken aloud, do not return quietly to silence. I should have expected she wouldn't let it settle quietly. Control rarely retreats without one final demonstration. 2 days after my siblings left, I came home to something unusual. My bedroom door was closed tightly, more firmly than normal. The hallway felt colder, though the thermostat hadn't changed. When I tried the handle, it didn't turn. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. Not confused, just absorbing the message. She had changed the lock. I walked back toward the kitchen slowly. She was seated at the table again, posture straight and deliberate. A small set of keys rested near her elbow. "You locked my room," I said evenly. "I secured my house," she replied without looking up. The words were chosen carefully. "You had no right to touch my belongings," I answered calmly. She finally met my eyes. "You forced this situation," she said. There it was. The shift from quiet dismissal to retaliation. "Unlock it," I said softly. "No," she replied. The word was firm and final. I studied her face for anger. Instead, I saw something else. Pride mixed with fear. "This isn't legal," I told her. "Joint ownership includes shared access." She reached for her phone. "Maybe we should ask someone official about that," she said. I knew what she meant before she finished speaking. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car pulled into the driveway. The sight of flashing lights against our quiet suburban street felt surreal. Neighbors' curtains shifted slightly across the road. Front doors opened just enough to observe. Public attention had arrived. An officer stepped out calmly and approached the porch. I opened the door before he knocked. "Is there a problem here?" he asked politely. "My daughter is refusing to leave my property," my mother said immediately. Her tone was wounded, almost fragile. I felt the old dynamic surface instantly. She, the distressed homeowner. Me, the difficult adult child. "I co-own this property," I said evenly. "I have documentation." The officer looked between us carefully. "Do you have proof of that?" he asked. "Yes," I answered. I retrieved the folder from the living room cabinet. My hands did not shake. I handed him a copy of the deed. He reviewed it slowly under the porch light. The neighborhood remained unusually quiet. After a moment, he nodded slightly. "This appears to be joint ownership," he said. "Ma'am, you cannot legally evict a co-owner." The word evict hung heavy in the air. My mother's shoulders stiffened. "That's not what I'm doing," she insisted. "I'm just asking her to leave. Without a legal agreement or court order, she has equal standing," the officer replied calmly. Equal standing. Hearing it publicly confirmed changed the atmosphere instantly. The neighbors watching from a distance no longer saw rebellion. They saw a dispute between co-owners. The narrative had shifted in plain sight. "She changed the lock on my bedroom," I added quietly. The officer glanced toward my mother. "You can't restrict access to jointly owned property," he said gently. For the first time, embarrassment crossed her face clearly. She handed over the spare key, without speaking. The officer remained professional and neutral. "This is a civil matter," he said. "I suggest you both consult an attorney before escalating further." Escalating further. He returned to his car and drove away slowly. The porch light flickered faintly in the silence afterward. I stepped back inside carefully. The air felt heavier than before, but not unstable. She stood near the kitchen counter, avoiding my gaze. "You didn't have to involve the police," she said quietly. "You called them," I replied gently. Her lips pressed together tightly. I was trying to protect myself, she added. So was I answered. The difference was no longer private. It had unfolded under flashing lights. I walked back down the hallway and unlocked my bedroom door. Nothing inside had been disturbed visibly, but the lock itself felt symbolic. She had attempted to assert control physically. Public authority had corrected it calmly. When I returned to the kitchen, she remained standing there. You humiliated me, she said softly. I paused before responding. I didn't humiliate you, I said carefully. I clarified reality. Her eyes glistened slightly, but no tears fell. The humiliation she felt was not public judgment. It was loss of unquestioned authority. That evening, the house felt changed permanently. Not broken, but exposed. The neighbors would talk quietly for days. Speculation would travel through fences and sidewalks. But what mattered most had already happened. Her attempt to remove me publicly had instead confirmed my standing publicly. Control had met documentation, and documentation had won without shouting. I lay in bed later that night, staring at the ceiling fan. The same one that turned steadily the morning everything shifted. The humiliation attempt had not destroyed anything.
It had revealed something.
She could no longer pretend I was temporary, and neither could anyone else watching from their windows. The morning after the police left, the house felt unfamiliar. Not because anything had changed physically, but because everything had been witnessed. Public confirmation carries a different weight than private knowledge. I woke early again, before sunrise. The sky outside my window was pale and quiet. For the first time in weeks, I did not feel anxious. I felt resolved. When I walked into the kitchen, she was already seated at the table. No coffee in front of her this time. Just the blue folder resting neatly beside her hand. She looked older that morning. Not physically fragile, but emotionally exposed. I spoke to the attorney, she said softly. I nodded and took a seat across from her. And he confirmed what the officer said, she replied. You have equal legal rights. There was no bitterness in her voice now, only acknowledgement. The words seemed to cost her something. For years, she had framed the house as her final proof of independence. After my father died, ownership had become symbolic. It represented survival. It represented control. Now, that symbol was shared. I didn't mean to make you look powerless, I said carefully. She shook her head slowly. That's exactly what it feels like. I let the silence stretch gently between us. Power is not always about dominance. Sometimes it is about identity. When we signed those papers, I said softly, it wasn't about taking anything from you. She looked at the table while I continued. It was about protecting each other. Her fingers rested lightly on the edge of the folder. I didn't think it would ever matter like this, she admitted. Neither did I replied. The truth had landed. Not dramatically. Not with shouting. Just with confirmation. We were no longer debating assumptions. We were facing facts. I panicked, she said quietly, when I asked you to leave. I studied her expression carefully.
Why?
I asked gently. She hesitated, choosing her words. I felt like I was losing control of my own life, she said. Like everything was changing faster than I could manage. Her honesty softened something inside me. This had never been entirely about me. It had been about aging, about fear, about relevance. I never wanted to replace you, I said softly. I know, she answered, but sometimes it felt like you were stronger than I was. The admission hung in the air. For years, she had positioned herself as the authority, the capable one, the resilient widow who survived everything. My steadiness had begun to threaten that identity. I wasn't trying to compete, I said. I was trying to help. She nodded faintly. I see that now, she whispered. The house around us felt quieter than usual. Not tense. Not heavy. Just aware. I can't ask you to leave, she said finally. It was not surrender. It was recognition. You don't have to, I replied. I don't want to fight over walls. Her eyes met mine directly for the first time in days. What do you want? She asked. I answered carefully. I want mutual decisions, I said. Respect.
Clarity.
No more pretending I'm temporary. She absorbed the words slowly. And if we disagree? She asked. Then we discuss, I replied. Like co-owners, not adversaries. The shift in language mattered deeply. Co-owners, not mother and child in a hierarchy, but two adults sharing responsibility. She exhaled slowly, almost as if releasing tension stored for months. I handled this badly, she admitted. Yes, I said gently. There was no satisfaction in agreeing, only honesty. I was afraid, she added. Fear had driven her to assert control. Control had led to escalation. Escalation had led to exposure. And exposure had led to truth. We sat at that table for nearly an hour afterward. No raised voices. No accusations. Just conversation that should have happened earlier. We discussed practical matters calmly. Property taxes. Maintenance plans. Clear communication going forward. The house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt like shared responsibility acknowledged openly. When I stood up to refill my coffee, the movement felt natural again. Not cautious. Not defensive. Natural. The truth had landed fully now. Not just legally. Emotionally. She could not erase my standing. And I did not want to erase hers. The balance between us had shifted permanently. Not into rivalry, but into clarity. As the morning light filled the kitchen slowly, I realized something quietly important. The house had not changed owners. It had changed understanding. And sometimes, that is enough to rebuild something, without tearing it down. Clarity does not erase consequences. It simply makes them harder to avoid. The morning after our long conversation, I felt steadier than I had in weeks. Not victorious. Not relieved entirely. Just grounded. The house felt different now. Not because the walls had moved or furniture shifted, but because the hierarchy had softened. She was in the living room reading when I walked in. Her posture was upright, but not rigid. The blue folder was no longer sitting out in plain sight. That mattered. Can we talk again? I asked gently. She placed her bookmark carefully between the pages. Yes. We sat across from each other, this time without tension vibrating between us. I've been thinking. I began slowly. We can't go back to how things were. She nodded faintly. I know. Her voice carried fatigue, not resistance. For this to work, I continued, we need structure. She raised an eyebrow slightly. What kind of structure? Clear agreements, I replied. Financial transparency. Shared decisions on repairs. Boundaries. The word boundaries used to irritate her. Now it made her thoughtful. I don't want to feel like I'm asking permission in my own house, she said quietly. You're not, I answered. And neither am I. That was the point. Equality requires discomfort before it becomes normal. I'll continue covering my share of expenses, I said calmly. But I want it acknowledged as partnership, not assistance. She absorbed that carefully. And if I decide I want to sell someday? She asked. Then we discuss it legally and fairly, I replied. No surprise decisions. The room felt calm, but serious. For the first time, we were speaking like two adults managing property, not like a parent disciplining a child. I shouldn't have changed the lock, she said quietly. No, I answered gently. She looked down at her hands. That was fear. I know, I said. There was no need to revisit the police or neighbors. The lesson had already been learned. I don't want to feel pushed aside as I get older, she admitted softly. The honesty in her voice was new. You're not being pushed aside, I said. But neither am I. That balance was fragile, but necessary. We talked through practical consequences next. If either of us wanted to make major changes, it would require joint consent. If tension escalated again, we would consult mediation instead of reacting impulsively. No more unilateral deadlines. No more quiet ultimatums. "Do you still want to live here?" she asked suddenly. The question surprised me. "Yes," I answered after a pause. "But not under threat." She nodded slowly. "I don't want you here out of obligation," she said. "I'm not here out of obligation," I replied. "I'm here because it's home." The word home felt different now. Not assumed. Earned. There would be consequences beyond paperwork. Trust would take time to rebuild. Family dynamics would need adjustment. My siblings would have to accept the new balance. But those were necessary shifts. "You'll tell your brother and sister?" she asked carefully. "Yes," I said. "They deserve clarity too." She exhaled softly, almost relieved. The power she once held unquestioned had transformed, not into weakness, into shared responsibility. And shared responsibility demands humility. "I don't want resentment growing in this house," she said quietly. "Then we don't let silence build it," I replied. That was the consequence we both understood. Silence had created this fracture. Honesty would be the only repair. We sat together for several minutes afterward without speaking. Not awkwardly, just thoughtfully. The house felt balanced again, but not naive. We both knew something fundamental had shifted. The old dynamic was gone permanently. She could no longer issue decisions alone. I could no longer hide behind quiet compliance. There was accountability now. And accountability, though uncomfortable, was healthier than control. When I stood to leave the room, she spoke softly. "I never meant to make you feel temporary." I paused at the doorway. "I know," I said. "But that's how it felt." She nodded slowly. "I'll do better," she whispered. "So will I," I replied. The consequences were not dramatic punishments. They were adjustments. Respect had to be intentional now. Communication had to be direct. The house would remain standing, but the way we lived inside it would never return to unspoken hierarchy. And that, in its quiet way, was the most meaningful consequence of all. The house did not celebrate our new understanding. It simply settled. In the days that followed, nothing dramatic happened. No more raised voices. No more sudden ultimatums. Just ordinary mornings returning slowly to routine. But ordinary felt different now. I noticed it in small details. The way she asked, "What do you think?" instead of declaring what would happen. The way I answered without defensiveness, without rehearsing arguments in my head. Balance is quiet when it finally arrives. One evening, I stood alone in the kitchen after dinner. The window above the sink reflected my face faintly. The same woman who had once sat there feeling temporary. I did not feel temporary anymore. Not triumphant. Not victorious. Just rooted. Mom walked in slowly and stood beside me. Neither of us spoke for a moment. "The house feels different," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. "It doesn't feel smaller," she added. "It just feels shared." The word no longer carried tension. Shared had stopped meaning threatened. It now meant supported. There were still fragile places between us. Trust does not rebuild overnight. Habits of control do not disappear instantly. But awareness had replaced denial. And awareness changes behavior. My siblings adjusted slowly as well. Conversations became less accusatory. Family dinners felt cautious at first, then gradually normal again. No one mentioned the police visit directly, but no one dismissed my standing anymore either. The oak tree outside continued shedding leaves into the yard. Autumn arrived without asking permission. Life moved forward. Sometimes I would sit in the living room alone at night, the lamp casting soft light across the carpet. I would think about how easily I could have left. Packed quietly. Accepted the narrative. Walked away to preserve comfort. But comfort built on erasure is not peace. Standing firm had not destroyed the family.
It had forced honesty into it.
One afternoon, Mom handed me a stack of paperwork. Property tax forms came in, she said casually. We should review them together. Together. The word carried no hesitation now. We sat at the dining table and went through numbers calmly. No defensiveness. No subtle positioning. Just two adults managing responsibility. It struck me then how much fear had shaped the earlier conflict. Fear of aging. Fear of losing authority. Fear of being replaced. But fear, when unspoken, turns into control. And control, when challenged, turns into escalation. What we had done differently was simple. We brought the truth into the open before resentment hardened. The house no longer felt like contested ground. It felt like a structure that had survived a stress test. Stronger not because it never cracked, but because it did not collapse. Late one night, I walked through the hallway slowly. The floorboards creaked the same way they always had. The photographs along the wall looked unchanged. But my place in the story had shifted permanently. I was no longer waiting for permission to belong. I belonged because it was legally true, because it was emotionally earned, because it had been defended calmly. Mom met me in the hallway that night. She paused beside me quietly. I'm glad you didn't leave, she said. So am I answered. The simplicity of the exchange carried weight. We had both come close to breaking something irreversible. Not just property, relationship. But we stepped back before resentment became permanent. The storm had not been loud or theatrical. It had been precise. A lock changed. A patrol car parked. A deed unfolded under porch light. Small actions. Lasting impact. The quiet after the storm was not empty. It was thoughtful. I still wake early sometimes and listen to the house breathe. The refrigerator hums softly. The floorboards settle into place. But now, the air feels steady. Not conditional. Not measured. Steady. The lesson was not about winning. It was about remembering. Remembering what we signed. Remembering what partnership means. Remembering that love without respect slowly becomes control. And control, left unchecked, will always test the foundation. The foundation held, not because one of us surrendered, but because both of us accepted truth. And sometimes, that is how a home is rebuilt, without anyone having to leave it. If this story felt familiar in any way, if you've ever been made to feel temporary in a place you helped build, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Your experiences matter here. And if you appreciate slow, realistic emotional storytelling about family, boundaries, and quiet strength, consider subscribing to American Granny Stories. There's always another story waiting.